How's it going there, guys? Dave Nader here, and today I have another book review for you. A book review for pretty much the singular most iconic and popular science fiction novel ever written, just about. Dune, written by Frank Herbert and released in 1965. This, for sure, is an extremely influential novel. I mean, it takes place in a desert planet with multiple moons, to say the least. And what other popular sci-fi franchise do you know of that has popular desert planet with multiple moons? I'm not going to say it because you almost definitely know what it is. And without getting too much into the plot, because this is a dense story and a big story and a fair amount happens throughout the whole book, so trying to sum it up fairly simply, just stuff that's important for the first couple hundred pages, this book focuses on two different houses, the Harkonnen and the Atreides houses, that are part of an imperium which is run, shockingly enough, by an emperor. And the Harkonnens and the Atreides hate each other, and the Harkonnens have ruled this planet called Arrakis, also known as Dune. Haha, that's the title! For 80 years, and finally they're letting loose control of the planet, and control is being transferred over to the Atreides. And the Duke Leto of Atreides is, it's very obvious to him that there's going to be some form of a trap, or probably a bunch of traps laid out on this planet for him and his house. But he has his own reasons for wanting to go there to begin with. Mainly that has to do with the Fremen. Fremen, I mean, it's only one E, so I guess Fremen. And those are a nomadic group of people who are, at this point, very accustomed to the very harsh landscapes that are to be found on Dune. And I'm not really going to go into why he especially wants to strike up a deal with them, but it becomes pretty apparent in the story. And, it's pretty smart, so despite the fact that it's like, really, dude, you're just willingly going into a trap like this, he has very good reasons for doing so, and it's well thought out. And again, big story, bunch of stuff happens, so it's not really much to give away, things that happen in the first couple of pages. This attack does happen, and what makes it interesting is that the Harkonnens are not just themselves going against the House Atreides, they're actually making a very shady deal with the Emperor himself, and working with his Sardaukar, which are a very powerful military force who just eclipse all of the other military forces of all the other houses in terms of its military might, and they just want to completely wipe out the House Atreides and all its inhabitants off the face of, not the Earth, but Dune. And Paul and his mother, the Lady Jessica being the wife of the Duke Leto of Atreides and Paul being his son, and the protagonist of this novel, have to go out into the running along the sands of Dune, trying to take refuge from the enemy, and eventually trying to strike up a deal with the Fremen. And that's all I'm going to go into plot-wise with this book, because you should definitely check it out for yourself. And this book is incredible. It's an extremely well-written book. I mean, I can't think of a single line. Admittedly, it's a big book, so, maybe there's one in there, but it's not really the point. I can't think of a single line to where I was like, ooh, that was just cheesy, a line of dialogue there, or that was just a poorly written phrase, or that was just a bad description of the environment. I mean, nowhere to be found in this book. It's very well written. A lot of the writing that takes up this book is description of the landscape as the characters walk through it, and it's very immersive, to say the least. Dune is an excellent setting for this book, and it's definitely a very harsh landscape, so you feel for the characters as they're definitely struggling to survive in this book, especially Paul and his mother Jessica, and the journey that he, and as well as his mother and other characters in the book, but especially the journey that the main character Paul takes throughout this book, is just outstanding. It's extremely interesting, as well as exciting, despite the fact that there aren't many big battles in this book. Or rather, there are, but most of them are described in past tense. They've already happened. It's a character just trying to recover from the big battle happening, which in a lot of cases might annoy me, but it actually builds up an air of myth and legend to the story, which makes it feel even more epic. But that was besides the point I was trying to get to before. Just Paul's journey constantly just surprised me with the very intelligent turns that it took, and my mind was blown at times, honestly, with the things that happened to him and just throughout the whole story. The plot takes some very intelligent turns, things that I just would not have expected, and when you look at where Paul starts at the beginning of the story, by the end of the story, it's just such an impressive change. He's a very interesting and likable protagonist. And what's especially interesting is that while this journey is exciting and you're really rooting for him, you want him to succeed and be able to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, you want to see him survive, and he's just an interesting character to read about. But there's some pretty dark implications that his journey sets up, and I'm not really going to talk about it much. Apparently the sequels actually delve into and realize in book form, the implications that are set up for this story. Although I didn't really want to read those books going into this one. Although because this book is so good, I might at some point check out the sequels, but just going from word of mouth. So, you didn't hear it from me, but just going from word of mouth, I've heard those books aren't very good. So I might or might not check those out, but that's besides the point because this book stands on its own very well. This book sets up some very dark implications, and it's very interesting, and I'm being vague about that because you should definitely read the story yourself. But it just kind of, in some ways, throws for a loop the standard archetype of the hero's journey in a very clever ways. And I also liked how this book mixed together, excitement and triumph for the characters, and you feel proud of the characters for the things that they accomplished in the story, especially Paul. But at the same time, you're kind of just kind of fretful about characters like, well, are they even to be trusted? I mean, even our protagonist, maybe there's some possibly shady things about what he could bring to fruition in the future. But again, I'm probably saying too much already in the way of spoilers. I'm just trying to emphasize that it's just an incredibly well thought out story to this book. All the dialogue in the book is also well written. There's some good humor at times. It's also communicates the drama very well, and there's certainly a fair amount of necessary exposition in this book, but when the dialogue is what gets the exposition out of the way, it flows very well, and it doesn't, catch your attention in an unflattering light at all. And this book is slow-paced, to be sure, despite the fact that, I said that there wasn't really all that much action, but there actually is, because you get a fair amount of one-on-one knife fights in this book, and overall just the events of the story are just enthralling and exciting and adventurous the whole time, and there's just great writing all throughout. But it is more or less a fairly slow-paced story. It's a slow-moving story, and yet for sure it keeps your interest, and it definitely enthralled me the whole time. And that's, as I've mentioned in past book reviews, especially like Peter Straub's Ghost Story, that was a slow-paced book, and yet it kept me interested the whole time. This also, it's commendable in that regard again. Also, this book has a whole lot of characters, as it is a dense story, and yet the book made it very easy for me to be able to keep track of and differentiate between all of them. A lot of the characters are likable, and the ones that are not supposed to be likable are really not likable. Let's talk about the villain, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. Maybe one of the best villains I've ever at least read about, but just in general, I think one of the best villains in a sci-fi story that I can think of. He is disgusting and horrible and very well written and intimidating, and you just hate him, but he's also just a very interesting character, and he got just the right amount of, I was about to say screen time, not screen time, page time, word time, I don't know, whatever you want to say, just the right amount of, I'm gonna say screen time again, to the point to where it's not just overexposing you to his horribleness. It's like, it's just overkill. But at the same time, he's used minimally enough just so he can just be kind of there in the back of your mind, thinking like, wow, I really hope the characters are able to overcome this guy and beat him because he's awful. But also the characters that are not very, are not given a whole lot of exposure are also well written, and you can, understand the inner workings of their personality and what differentiates them from other characters in the story, and that's always commendable when you have so many characters, and including the ones that don't get a whole lot of exposure as opposed to the ones that do get more exposure, when they're all just so well realized and you can, think about them. Piter de Vries and Eakin Nafood. I'm definitely pronouncing the names probably incorrectly. But I mean, those are just small characters, but I can still remember their names in the back of my mind. So, you know, that's, you know, it's commendable. I keep on reusing the word commendable, but it is. It's just an incredibly well-written story. It's very smart. It went in directions consistently, like repeatedly, that I did not expect. And I went like, what? Like my jaw dropped at times. And when I went, what? It's not like a bad thing. It's just kind of like, wow, I didn't expect us to end up at this point, but bam, you know, just this is where he started in the story, and now we're here. It's just, oh, you know, and I mainly mentioned Paul's character as being, you know, he goes through a big journey, but like other characters as well. The Lady Jessica, she's also a very likable character, and she was the character that I cared about probably the most in this whole story. She's just a very understandable and compelling character, and the way she is trying to, you know, protect her son Paul from certain things, especially in the beginning of the story. But at the same time, you juxtapose that with the fact that Paul is having to do most of the dirty work in trying to protect her later on in the story when they're trying to, you know, run away from the Sardaukar and the Harkonnens. It's just an amazing story, and I don't have too much else to say about it that, one, probably hasn't been said before, and two, that, you know, wouldn't involve going more into spoilers. But real quick, guys, because it occurred to me that I didn't mention two big things that I really should mention in a review for this book, and that is the spice melange and the worms. Now, the spice melange, when I was saying that there were turns that this book took that really blew me away, I was especially referring to the role that the spice melange ends up taking later on in the story in relation to Paul, and just just put simply, trying to be sort of vague, as I generally try to do in these reviews because I don't do spoilers like most any good reviewer tries to do, or not do. Just the relationship that Paul ends up developing and the, you know, things that he realizes about the spice, and, you know, how it connects to him in a certain way. I mean, I'm probably saying too much already, but it's extremely interesting. And as for the worms, you know, you gotta give a book props when you're impressed by the description of the worms, and on the same level that you would be as if you're actually viewing it on screen, like these big sequences with worms, you know, like in big special effects glory. Because when I was reading this book, obviously I wasn't watching a movie where that was happening. I was just looking at words on a page, and that's just so impressive to me. And this applies to plenty of other good books in general. You know, it's the role that imagery takes in books. You know, why it's important to do that well for a book for the reader, but especially in this book more so than a lot of others that I've read. This book paints a very clear picture of very epic events in your mind, especially in relation to the worms and the way they're incorporated into Paul's journey later on, and the different tasks that he has to do involving them are very entertaining and sort of tense and suspenseful, and especially, again, without spoiling things, like in just the last confrontations of this book, like right in the end, like, you know, the climax of this book, the role that the worms take, it's just flat out cool. And that's all I'm going to say about these two things. But yes, now getting to the outro of the video. Because of the slow pace of this book, I was wondering if maybe I should downgrade it from an A+ to an A, and yet at the same time acknowledge that in all intents and purposes it's deserving of an A+. Just for my personal enjoyment, I might want to give it an A. But really, despite the fact that, yes, I probably won't want to reread this book for a decent little while, just because, you know, it's a dense story and it's fairly long, and, you know, it's kind of slow moving at times. At the same time, I was still enthralled for the entire time that I was reading it, and so really I gotta give this book my highest rating, an A+. But, you know, to begin with, as I alluded to, or really directly referenced in my last couple of videos, ratings systems, I admit, are kind of arbitrary in general, but whatever, that's besides the point. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I definitely hope you check out this book, Dune, although you maybe probably have, because, I mean, millions and millions of people have read this book over the years, and millions of people probably just currently just own this book. And, I mean, you know, took a way too long of a time to get around to actually reading this book, as is continuing to prove to be the case. You know, over the years on this YouTube channel reviewing books, I've been like, yeah, I should have read this book sooner, and that's more so than the vast majority of them the case for this one, because my uncle especially recommended this to me like 5 years ago, and I just didn't take him up on his word and read this book. But now I have, so thanks for the recommendation. Took way too long to get around to it, but you're right, this is an excellent book. And guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please rate and comment and subscribe. And if you want to, you can also share. Goodbye, guys.